The night sky stretched endlessly over the New Mexico territory, a blanket of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Samuel Wilder never counted them anymore, though there had been a time when he tried, back when he was young enough to believe counting stars might change his fortune. Now, at 32, he knew better. The open range was his home, the saddle his only chair, and the vast western sky his roof. Since his 15th birthday, Samuel hadn't slept under a proper ceiling, not once. The year was 1878, and Samuel guided his buckskin stallion, Copper, along the dusty trail that wound toward the settlement of Deeming. The town had sprung up alongside the railroad tracks laid by the Southern Pacific just a few years prior. Samuel had no particular business there, but winter was approaching, and he needed supplies before heading south to find work on one of the cattle drives that would run through the Arizona territory. He'd been drifting for 17 years now, earning his living as a hired gun, a ranch hand, occasionally a bounty hunter when times were lean. His father had been a farmer in Missouri, broken by the war and the drought that followed. His mother had died giving birth to what would have been his sister. After his father drank himself into the grave, Samuel had nothing left to keep him tethered to any one place. "Few more miles, boy," he murmured to Copper, whose ears flicked back at the sound of his voice. The horse was his only constant companion, purchased 5 years ago with every cent he'd saved from 6 months of breaking horses on a ranch near Santa Fe. As Samuel crested the hill overlooking Deeming, he was surprised by how much the town had grown since his last pass through. The railroad had brought people, and people had brought industry and commerce. The main street was lined with establishments: a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and what appeared to be a small hotel. Lamplight glowed from windows, creating golden squares in the darkness. But something else caught his eye. On the edge of town, set apart from the other buildings, stood a small cabin. Unlike the other structures whose windows were mostly dark at this late hour, this one had a lamp burning bright in the window facing the trail. It seemed to beckon, a star brought down to earth. Samuel shook his head, dismissing the strange pull he felt toward that light. He wasn't one for beds or roofs. The ground was good enough for him, had been for as long as he could remember. Even in the harshest winters, he'd find shelter in caves or beneath rock outcroppings, but never indoors. The walls made him feel trapped, reminded him of the coffin they'd lowered his father into. He guided Copper toward the livery stable, planning to secure the horse for the night before making his own camp outside of town. The streets were quiet, most decent folk having retired for the evening. Only the saloon showed signs of life, piano music and laughter spilling from its doors. As Samuel dismounted, he caught sight of a woman hurrying down the boardwalk, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She carried a basket covered with cloth, and despite her obvious hurry, there was something graceful about her movement. She glanced up as she passed, and for a brief moment her eyes met his. They were the color of summer sage, bright even in the dim light of the street lamps. "Evening, madam," Samuel said, tipping his hat out of habit. She paused as if surprised to be addressed. "Good evening." Her voice was clear and steady, not fearful as many women's might be when encountering a stranger after dark. She studied him briefly, taking in his trail-worn appearance. "New to Deeming. Just passing through," Samuel replied. "Needed to rest my horse and pick up supplies." She nodded, her gaze drifting to Copper. "That's a fine animal." "Thank you, madam. He's a good companion." The woman adjusted her basket. "Well, if you're looking for a meal, Mrs. Donnelly at the boarding house serves breakfast at 6. She hesitated. "And there's the saloon, though I don't recommend their food." Samuel found himself smiling. "I appreciate the advice. Penny," a man's voice called from down the street. "Penny, is that you?" The woman turned. "Yes, Dr. Fletcher, I'll be right there." She looked back at Samuel. "Good night, Mr. Wilder, Samuel Wilder." "Good night, Mr. Wilder. Welcome to Deeming." With that, she hurried toward the voice that had called her, disappearing into a building that must have been the doctor's office. Samuel watched her go, inexplicably curious about the woman with sage green eyes. Penny. The name suited her, somehow small but valuable. He led Copper into the livery stable, where an old man with a stooped back greeted him. "Need a stall for the night?" The man asked, eyeing Copper appreciatively. "Yes, sir, and a good feed of oats if you have them." "That'll be 50 cents for the night, including feed. Extra quarter if you want him groomed." Samuel dug into his pocket and produced the coins. "Grooming won't be necessary. I'll be back at first light to tend to him myself." The old man pocketed the money. "Suit yourself. You staying at the hotel?" "No, I'll make camp outside town." The stable keeper raised an eyebrow. "Storm's coming in from the west. Might want to reconsider. Hotel's $2 a night, but clean." Samuel just shook his head. "I've weathered worse than whatever's coming." After seeing Copper settled, Samuel made his way to the general store, which was still open despite the late hour. A bell jangled as he entered, and a round-faced man looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, sir?" "About to close up, but I can get you sorted quick if you need something." "Just some basics," Samuel said. "Coffee, beans, bacon, ammunition for a Winchester 73. As the shopkeeper gathered his supplies, the door opened again, and Samuel turned to see the doctor he'd heard calling for Penny earlier. He was a man of about 50, with graying hair and spectacles that sat low on his nose. "Evening, Thomas," the doctor said to the shopkeeper. "Just need some more bandages if you have them. Used the last of mine tonight." "How's the Harper girl?" the shopkeeper asked as he reached beneath the counter. "She'll be fine. Thanks to Miss Penny bringing her in when she did. Fever's broken and the cough is looser. Another day or two and she should be on the mend." Samuel found himself listening with more interest than he should have felt for town matters that had nothing to do with him. The doctor noticed him and nodded politely. "Good evening. Don't believe we've met." "Samuel Wilder," Samuel said, extending his hand. "Dr. James Fletcher, passing through." "Yes, sir, just for a night or two." The doctor eyed his trail-worn clothes. "Well, if you need medical attention, my office is just down the street, though you look hale enough." Samuel nodded his thanks as the shopkeeper returned with his supplies, all wrapped in brown paper. "That'll be $1.85, the shopkeeper said. Samuel paid and gathered his purchases. As he turned to leave, the doctor spoke again. "Mr. Wilder, if I may have you secured lodging for the night. There's a storm coming and it looks to be a bad one." "I appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine," Samuel replied. The doctor looked as though he might argue, but then simply shrugged. "Suit yourself. Good night, gentlemen." Outside, Samuel could indeed feel the change in the air. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. In the distance, lightning flickered across the sky, followed by the low rumble of thunder. He considered his options. He could still make camp, find some shelter under a rock outcropping or in a stand of trees. It wouldn't be the first time he'd weathered a storm under the open sky. But as he stood there, his eyes were drawn once more to that solitary cabin on the edge of town, its window still bright with lamplight. Without fully understanding why, Samuel found his feet carrying him in that direction. As he drew closer, he could see that the cabin was small but well maintained. A little garden patch to one side showed signs of careful tending, with late-season vegetables still growing. A small barn stood behind the main structure, and he could hear the soft nickering of a horse within. Samuel hesitated at the edge of the property. What was he doing here? He had no business approaching someone's home at this hour, yet something kept him from turning away. Perhaps it was the promise of shelter from the approaching storm, or perhaps it was curiosity about who would keep a lamp burning so late into the night. Before he could decide whether to approach or retreat, the door of the cabin opened, and a figure stepped onto the porch. Mr. Wilder. It was her Penny, the woman from town. She stood with a lantern in hand, her features illuminated by its warm glow. Her hair, which had been pinned up earlier, now fell in waves around her shoulders, the color of burnished copper in the lamplight. "Miss Penny," Samuel said, removing his hat. "I apologize for disturbing you. I was just looking for shelter from the storm," she supplied when he trailed off, unable to explain even to himself why he'd been drawn to her home. He nodded, though that hadn't been his conscious intent. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Wilder. No one should be out in what's coming." "I couldn't impose," he protested, though the first fat drops of rain had begun to fall, spattering the dust at his feet. "It's not an imposition. I'm Penelope Harper, by the way. Most folks call me Penny." She gestured toward the door. "Please, come in before you're soaked through." The sky chose that moment to open up, rain suddenly pouring down in sheets. With little choice, Samuel hurried up to the porch and followed Penny inside. The cabin was small but immaculately kept. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting warm light throughout the single room. A curtain partitioned off what he assumed was her sleeping area. A table with 2 chairs sat near the center, and a rocking chair was positioned by the fire. Everything was simple but well crafted, speaking of care and attention. "You can hang your coat there," Penny said, pointing to pegs by the door. Samuel did as instructed, feeling strangely unsettled. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been inside a proper home, let alone one as warm and welcoming as this. "I was just about to have some tea," Penny said, moving to the small stove where a kettle was beginning to steam. "Would you care for a cup, or perhaps coffee if you prefer?" "Tea would be fine, thank you," Samuel said, still standing awkwardly by the door. "Please sit." Penny gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "You're making me nervous hovering there like that." Samuel apologized and took a seat, placing his hat on the table before thinking better of it and setting it on his knee instead. "I saw you at the livery earlier," Penny said as she prepared 2 cups of tea. "Old Joe said you were planning to camp outside tonight." She glanced toward the window where rain now lashed against the glass. "I suppose nature had other plans." "It seems so," Samuel agreed, "though I've weathered worse." Penny brought the tea to the table and sat across from him. "Do you make a habit of sleeping rough, Mr. Wilder?" "Samuel, please," he said. "And yes, I suppose I do. Haven't slept indoors in 17 years." Her eyebrows rose. "Not once in 17 years. That's quite remarkable. May I ask why?" Samuel sipped his tea, buying time. He rarely spoke of his habits and never of the reasons behind them. Yet something about Penny's direct gaze made him want to answer honestly. "Started after my father died," he said finally. "I was 15, had no family left, no home to speak of. Took to the trail and I found I preferred the open sky to any ceiling." He shrugged. "Walls make me feel trapped." "Always have." Penny nodded, considering his words. "I can understand that. After my husband died, I couldn't bear to sleep in our bed. Spent months in that rocking chair by the fire." She nodded toward it. "Still do, some nights when the memories are too strong." "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel said, surprised by her candor. "It's been 3 years now." Penny's fingers traced the rim of her cup. "Thomas, my husband, was a rancher, had a small spread outside of town. He was killed by rustlers. And you've stayed on alone." "This was our home," she said simply. "I sold the ranch, couldn't manage it alone, but kept this cabin. I help Dr. Fletcher now and do some nursing for folks in town who need it." The rain continued to pound on the roof, and thunder rumbled overhead. The storm had arrived in full force, and Samuel was grudgingly grateful to be indoors rather than huddled under some inadequate shelter. "That light," he said, nodding toward the lamp in the window. "You keep it burning late." A slight smile touched Penny's lips. "I do. It was a promise I made to Thomas. He used to say that no matter how late he was coming back from checking the herd, he always knew his way home because I kept a light burning." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "After he died, I kept it up out of habit. Then I realized it might help others who were lost or in need of shelter." Her gaze returned to him. Like tonight, Samuel felt a strange tightening in his chest. Her words struck him in a way he hadn't expected, like she'd somehow seen through the layers of dust and solitude to something inside him he'd long buried. "It's a kind thing to do," he managed. "It's a small thing," she corrected. "But sometimes small things matter most." She rose from the table. "You must be hungry. I have some stew left from dinner." Before Samuel could protest, she was ladling stew from a pot kept warm at the edge of the stove into a bowl. The smell of it made his mouth water, reminding him he hadn't eaten since noon. "This is very generous of you," he said as she placed the bowl before him, along with a chunk of bread. "It's nothing fancy," Penny said, retaking her seat. "Just rabbit and vegetables from the garden." Samuel took a bite and had to stop himself from groaning aloud at how good it tasted. "It's delicious." A pleased smile lit her face, and Samuel found himself noticing how it transformed her features, bringing a brightness to her eyes that hadn't been there before. They fell into conversation as he ate, exchanging the kind of details travelers often share where they'd been, things they'd seen. Samuel told her about his years on the trail, the ranch jobs and cattle drives, the seasons spent trapping in the mountains. Penny spoke of her life in Deeming, her work with the doctor, her small garden. "You ever get lonely?" she asked as the hour grew late and the storm showed no signs of abating. "Out there on your own?" Samuel considered the question, something no one had asked him in years. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've gotten used to my own company and Copper's a good listener." "Your horse," Penny said with a smile. "I noticed him earlier. He's beautiful. He's been with me 5 years now, best investment I ever made." Penny stifled a yawn and Samuel realized how late it must be. "I should let you get some rest," he said, rising from his chair. "I can sleep on the porch. The rain's letting up some." "Don't be ridiculous," Penny said firmly. "The storm's still raging. You'll stay here tonight." She gestured to the rocking chair. "You can have that by the fire, and there are blankets in the chest. I'll be fine behind the curtain." Samuel wanted to refuse, to insist on sleeping outside as he always did, but the warmth of the cabin and something in Penny's determined expression made him reconsider. "Just for tonight," he conceded. "And I'll be gone at first light, so I won't disturb your morning." "As you wish," Penny said, though he thought he detected a note of disappointment in her voice. "Good night, Samuel." "Good night, Penny." After she disappeared behind the curtain, Samuel settled into the rocking chair, wrapping a quilt around himself. Despite his usual aversion to sleeping indoors, he found himself comfortable, lulled by the crackling of the fire and the now gentler patter of rain on the roof. His last thought before drifting off was of the lamp still burning in the window, and the woman who kept it lit to guide lost souls home. The dawn broke clear and crisp after the storm, sunlight streaming through the windows of the cabin. Samuel woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. It took him a moment to remember where he was inside Penny Harper's cabin, having slept indoors for the first time in 17 years. Strangely, he'd slept better than he had in months. No nightmares, no waking at every sound, just deep, restful sleep. The cabin was quiet, and a glance toward the curtained area showed no movement. Penny must still be asleep. Samuel rose quietly, folded the quilt, and placed it back in the chest. He put on his boots and coat and picked up his hat, intending to slip out without disturbing her. But as he reached for the door, her voice came from behind him. Leaving without saying goodbye, Samuel turned to find Penny standing by the curtain, already dressed for the day in a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned up. She looked as though she'd been awake for some time. "Didn't want to wake you," Samuel said, somewhat sheepishly. "I've been up for an hour," she replied. "Just giving you the courtesy of sleeping in. There's coffee on the stove and I was about to start breakfast." Samuel hesitated. He had planned to collect copper and be on his way, continue south as he'd intended. But the offer of coffee and breakfast, and if he was honest with himself, a few more minutes in Penny's company was tempting. "I shouldn't impose further," he said, though he made no move toward the door. "It's not an imposition," Penny said, moving to the stove. "Besides, after a storm like that, the trails will be muddy. Another hour won't make much difference." Samuel couldn't argue with her logic. He hung his hat back on the peg and moved to help her with breakfast. She assigned him the task of slicing bread while she prepared eggs and bacon. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around the small kitchen space with an ease that surprised him. As they sat down to eat, Penny asked, "Where are you headed next?" "South, probably. There's usually work with the cattle herds in the winter. Or I might try my hand at trapping again if I can get far enough into the mountains before the heavy snows." Penny nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Deeming has work if you're interested. The railroad brings new opportunities every day." Samuel looked at her, trying to read the intent behind her words. Was she merely being friendly, or was there something more? "I've never been one for staying in one place too long," he said carefully. "So you've said." She met his gaze steadily. "But even the most dedicated wanderer needs a home base sometimes." Before Samuel could respond, a knock came at the door. Penny rose to answer it, revealing Dr. Fletcher on the porch. "Morning, Penny," the doctor said, then spotted Samuel at the table. "Mr. Wilder. Good to see you found shelter from the storm." "Miss Harper was kind enough to offer me a place by her fire," Samuel said, standing. The doctor nodded, then turned back to Penny. "Sorry to interrupt your breakfast, but the Miller baby is coming and Mrs. Miller is asking for you." "Of course," Penny said. "Let me get my things." She hurried to gather a bag from a shelf. Samuel felt suddenly out of place, an intruder in the routine of their lives. "I should be going anyway," he said. "Need to check on my horse." Penny paused in her preparations. "Will you be staying in Deeming another night?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities. Samuel found himself torn, the familiar urge to move on warring with an unfamiliar desire to stay. "I'm not sure yet," he answered honestly. Something like disappointment flickered across Penny's face, but she covered it quickly. "Well, if you do, the light will be on." With that, she followed the doctor out the door, leaving Samuel alone in the cabin that had unexpectedly given him the best night's sleep in years. At the livery stable, Samuel found Copper well rested and eager to be on the trail again. Old Joe, the stable keeper, was brushing down another horse when he arrived. "Thought you might have been washed away in that storm last night," the old man remarked. "Where'd you end up sheltering?" "Miss Harper was kind enough to offer her floor," Samuel replied, running a hand down Copper's neck. Joe's eyebrows shot up. "Penny Harper took you in? Well, I'll be. She's particular about who she lets into that cabin of hers." He gave Samuel an appraising look. "Must have seen something in you she liked." Samuel felt unaccountably pleased by this assessment, though he tried not to show it. "She's a generous woman." "That she is," Joe agreed. Been through her share of hardship but never lost her kindness. Whole town respects her for it. He paused in his brushing. You planning to move on today? Samuel hesitated. I'm not sure yet. Might stay another day or two, let the trails dry out some. Joe nodded sagely. Smart thinking. No sense getting bogged down in mud if you don't have to. He returned to his task. If you're looking for work while you wait, Simmons at the Mercantile was saying just yesterday he could use a hand unloading the supply wagons coming in. The idea of staying longer, of perhaps seeing Penny again, was becoming more appealing by the minute. I might look into that. Thank you. After seeing to Copper's needs, Samuel made his way to the Mercantile. Thomas Simmons, the shopkeeper he'd met the previous evening, was indeed in need of help and seemed relieved when Samuel offered his services. Wagons due in this afternoon, Simmons said. 50 cents for the job, should take a couple of hours. That's fair, Samuel agreed. Come back around 2 o'clock, Simmons instructed. In the meantime, if you're looking for a meal, Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house serves dinner at noon for 25 cents. Best food in town. With time to kill, Samuel decided to explore Deeming. The town was busier than it had appeared the night before, with people going about their business despite the muddy streets left by the storm. The railroad had clearly brought prosperity to the area. New buildings were under construction, and the existing ones showed signs of recent improvements. As he walked, Samuel found his thoughts returning to Penny. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, a quality he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just her kindness or her beauty, though both were considerable. Perhaps it was the strength he sensed in her, the resilience that had allowed her to build a life alone after losing her husband. Or perhaps it was the way she'd looked at him not as a drifter or a hired gun, but as a man worthy of respect and consideration. Without consciously intending it, Samuel found himself walking toward Dr. Fletcher's office. He told himself he was merely curious about the town doctor's practice, but he knew the real reason was the hope of catching another glimpse of Penny. The doctor's office was a small, neat building with a shingle hanging outside that read James Fletcher, M.D. Samuel hesitated, then decided there was no harm in inquiring if the doctor needed any assistance with tasks around his office. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Penny emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "Samuel," she said, clearly surprised to see him. "I thought you'd be on the trail by now." "Decided to stay another day or two," he said. "The trails are still muddy and I found some work unloading supply wagons for the Mercantile." A smile brightened her features. "That's good news. For the Mercantile, I mean. How's the Miller baby?" Samuel asked, nodding toward the doctor's office. "Healthy and strong. A boy their first." Pride colored her voice. 7 pounds delivered without complications. Congratulations. To them and to you." Penny brushed a strand of hair from her face, looking suddenly self-conscious. "I only assisted. Dr. Fletcher did the real work." "Don't sell yourself short," came the doctor's voice as he joined them on the porch. "Mrs. Miller was calmer with you there than she'd have been with just me. That makes all the difference sometimes." Penny accepted the compliment with a small nod. "I should get back home and rest a bit before my afternoon rounds. There are several patients in town I need to check on." "I'll walk with you," Samuel offered, surprising himself as much as her. "If that's all right." "I'd like that," Penny said softly. They bid the doctor goodbye and set off toward Penny's cabin, walking side by side through the busy streets. Several townspeople greeted Penny warmly as they passed, and she introduced Samuel to each of them. He was struck by how seamlessly she seemed to fit into the fabric of the town, how valued she was by its residents. "You're well respected here," Samuel observed after they'd passed a group of women who had insisted on showing Penny a quilt they were making. I try to be useful, Penny replied. After Thomas died, I needed purpose. Helping others gave me that. Is that why you keep the light burning, to help others? Penny was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Partly. It started as a way to hold on to Thomas to keep my promise to him, but it's become something more. A symbol, I suppose, that no one need face the darkness alone. Her words resonated deep within Samuel, touching something he'd long buried beneath layers of solitude and self-reliance. He'd been facing the darkness alone for so long he'd forgotten there could be any other way. They reached Penny's cabin, and she turned to face him. Would you like to come in for coffee? I understand if you have other things to attend to. Samuel knew the sensible thing would be to decline, to maintain the distance that had kept him safe for years. But standing there, looking into Penny's earnest face, he found he didn't want to be sensible. Coffee sounds good, he said. Inside, the cabin felt different in daylight, smaller perhaps, but no less welcoming. Penny busied herself at the stove while Samuel sat at the table, watching her move with practiced efficiency. How long have you been assisting Dr. Fletcher? He asked. Almost 2 years now, Penny said as she set the coffee to boil. I had some experience with healing herbs from my grandmother, and after Thomas died, the doctor noticed I had a way with patients. He offered to teach me what he knows. She smiled over her shoulder at him. It's not formal training, of course, but it's useful work. More than useful, from what I've seen, Samuel said. The doctor clearly values your help, and so do the townspeople. Penny brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat across from him. And what about you, Samuel Wilder? What do you value? The directness of her question caught him off guard. I haven't given it much thought, he admitted. Freedom, I suppose, the ability to come and go as I please. And is that enough? Penny asked, her eyes searching his face. Just coming and going, never staying. Samuel cradled his coffee cup, considering her question. For years, he would have said yes without hesitation. The open trail, the changing landscapes, the absence of attachments, these had been his comfort and his safety. But now, sitting in this warm cabin with a woman whose very presence seemed to challenge his long-held convictions, he found himself less certain. It has been, he said finally. Until now. Penny's eyes widened slightly and a flush crept into her cheeks. And what's changed? Samuel met her gaze steadily. I'm not entirely sure yet. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Penny glanced away, breaking the tension. I should rest before my afternoon rounds, she said, rising from the table. And you have work at the mercantile. Samuel stood as well, oddly reluctant to leave. Yes, the supply wagon. I'll be there until sundown, most likely. Penny walked him to the door. Will you be staying in town again tonight? If you're offering, Samuel said, surprising himself with his boldness. The light will be on, Penny replied softly. Samuel nodded, understanding the invitation. I'll see you this evening then. As he made his way back to town, Samuel found himself torn between the familiar urge to saddle Copper and ride out away from these unfamiliar feelings, and the complications they threatened, and the growing desire to return to Penny's cabin, to the warmth and welcome he'd found there. By the time he reached the mercantile, the supply wagon had arrived, and Samuel was glad for the physical labor that would occupy his body and mind for the next few hours. The work was straightforward, unloading crates of goods from the wagon and carrying them into the store, where Simmons directed their placement. As Samuel worked, he overheard conversations among the townspeople who came and went from the mercantile. Several mentioned Penny, speaking of her with respect and affection. One older woman told another how Penny had sat up all night with her ailing husband, applying cool compresses to his fevered brow. A man recounted how she'd helped deliver his wife's twins during a blizzard last winter when the doctor had been snowed in at another farm. These stories painted a picture of a woman deeply embedded in the life of her community, valued not just for her skills but for her compassion. It was a stark contrast to Samuel's existence, where he drifted into towns, performed whatever task was required, and moved on, leaving barely a ripple in his wake. By the time the wagon was empty and the goods stored, the sun was beginning to set. Simmons paid Samuel the agreed-upon 50 cents, with an extra quarter thrown in for the careful handling of some fragile items. "You do good work, Wilder," the shopkeeper said. "If you're staying in town a while, I could use your help again when the next shipment comes in next week." "I appreciate the offer," Samuel said, pocketing the coins. "I'm not sure how long I'll be around, but I'll let you know." Outside, the streets of Deeming were growing quiet as people headed home for the evening meal. Samuel considered his options. He could go to the saloon for dinner and a drink, rent a room at the hotel for the night, or the option that called to him most strongly, return to Penny's cabin, and the light she'd promised would be burning for him. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. Samuel retrieved Copper from the livery stable, ignoring old Joe's knowing look when he mentioned he might be back in the morning, and rode slowly toward the edge of town, where Penny's cabin stood. Sure enough, as he approached, he could see the lamp burning in the window, its warm glow cutting through the gathering darkness. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of cooking wafted on the evening air. Samuel dismounted and led Copper to the small barn behind the cabin. Inside, he found a stall next to Penny's mare, with fresh hay and water already provided. He took his time unsaddling and brushing down Copper, using the familiar routine to settle his own nerves. When he could delay no longer, Samuel gathered his saddlebags and walked to the cabin door. Before he could knock, it swung open to reveal Penny, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple dress of deep green that brought out the color of her eyes. "I was wondering if you'd come," she said. "You said the light would be on," Samuel replied simply. Penny smiled and stepped aside to let him enter. "I made stew again and biscuits. I hope you're hungry." "Starving," Samuel admitted, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. The cabin was warm and fragrant with the smell of cooking. They fell into an easy rhythm, Penny serving the meal while Samuel poured water from the pitcher into glasses. They talked about their day, Samuel's work at the mercantile, Penny's rounds to check on her patients. It felt strangely domestic, as if they'd done this 100 times before. After dinner, they moved to sit by the fire. Samuel took the chair while Penny settled on a small stool, her skirts spreading around her. "Tell me more about your life on the trail," Penny said. "What's the most beautiful place you've seen?" Samuel considered the question, thinking of all the landscapes he'd traversed over the years. "There's a valley in Colorado, high up in the mountains. In the spring, it's covered with wildflowers, blues and yellows and purples as far as you can see. The first time I came upon it, I thought I'd wandered into a dream." Penny smiled, her face soft in the firelight. "It sounds magical." "It was," Samuel agreed, "but lonely too. Beautiful things often are when there's no one to share them with." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Penny broke the silence first. "And the most dangerous situation you've faced?" Samuel rubbed his chin, where a day's growth of stubble had appeared. "Got caught in a blizzard once, up in Montana Territory. Lost the trail and my horse at the time was exhausted. I thought that might be the end of me, but I stumbled onto a trapper's cabin abandoned but with enough firewood to see me through the worst of the storm." "Providence," Penny murmured. "Maybe," Samuel said, "or just dumb luck." "I prefer to believe there's a pattern to things," Penny said. that we're guided to where we need to be, even if we don't recognize it at the time. Samuel studied her face, the earnestness in her expression. Is that why you think I ended up at your door last night? Providence? Penny met his gaze steadily. I think there was a reason the storm came when it did, and a reason you noticed the light in my window when so many others ride past without seeing it. And what reason might that be? Samuel asked, his voice lower than he'd intended. Perhaps we both needed something the other has to offer, Penny said softly. Samuel found himself leaning toward her, drawn by something he couldn't name. And what might I have that you need? Penny's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. A different perspective. Stories of places I'll never see, perhaps even just the company of someone who chose to notice the light. And what do you think I need that you can offer? Samuel asked, his heart beating faster. A reminder, Penny said, that not all walls are prisons. That sometimes, what looks like confinement from the outside might actually be shelter. Her words struck him with the force of truth. For 17 years, he'd equated indoor spaces with constraint, with the suffocating grief of his father's home after his mother's death. But sitting here in this cabin with its warm fire and the woman who kept the light burning, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. You may be right about that, Samuel admitted. Penny smiled, a hint of triumph in her expression. I usually am. The evening passed in conversation, with Penny sharing stories of her life before deeming, of growing up on a small farm in Missouri, not unlike the one Samuel had left behind. She spoke of meeting Thomas Harper when she was 18, of their brief but happy marriage cut short by violence. In turn, Samuel found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone about his mother's death, his father's decline into drink and despair, the day he'd buried the man and walked away from everything he'd known. So that's why you've never slept indoors, Penny said when he'd finished. You associate it with loss and confinement. I suppose I do, Samuel acknowledged, though last night was different. How so? Samuel gestured around the cabin. This place doesn't feel like a cage, it feels. Like what? Penny prompted when he hesitated. Like it could be a home, Samuel said quietly. If a man was looking for such a thing. Penny's breath caught audibly. And are you looking for a home? Samuel had asked himself the same question throughout the day, wrestling with the unfamiliar yearning that had taken root in him. I've been running so long I'm not sure I know how to stop, he admitted. But being here with you, it makes me want to try. Penny reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her touch was warm, grounding. There's no hurry, she said. The light will be on for as long as you need it. Samuel turned his hand to clasp hers, marveling at how small and delicate it felt in his weathered grasp. Thank you, Penny. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Penny behind her curtain, Samuel in the rocking chair by the fire, he found himself thinking not of the open trail that had always called to him, but of the possibility of putting down roots, of waking each morning to Penny's smile, of building something lasting in this town where she was so valued. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of possibility he hadn't felt in years. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt at once novel and strangely familiar to Samuel. Each morning, he would rise early, sometimes before Penny, and stoke the fire. He'd make coffee, and by the time Penny emerged from behind her curtain, breakfast would be underway. They'd share the morning meal, talking of their plans for the day, before going their separate ways, Penny to assist Dr. Fletcher or visit patients in town, Samuel to whatever work he could find. Simmons at the Mercantile was happy to employ him regularly, and word had spread of his reliability, leading to offers from the blacksmith and the livery stable for odd jobs. Each evening, Samuel would return to find the lamp burning in Penny's window, guiding him back to the cabin that was rapidly becoming more than just a temporary shelter. They'd share dinner, talking of their day, before settling by the fire for deeper conversations that often lasted well into the night. By the end of the week, Samuel had slept indoors for 7 consecutive nights, a fact that would have seemed impossible to him just days earlier. Each night, the walls seemed less confining, more protective. And each night, his awareness of Penny grew stronger, his admiration deepening into something more profound. On the 8th day, as Samuel was helping the blacksmith repair a wagon wheel, a commotion at the edge of town drew everyone's attention. A group of riders was approaching, their horses lathered and blowing from hard riding. "Trouble," the blacksmith muttered, setting down his hammer. The riders, 5 men, dusty from the trail and heavily armed, reined in before the saloon. Their leader, a tall man with a scar running along his jawline, dismounted first. "That's Jake Blackwood," the blacksmith said in a low voice. "Bad business. Him and his boys were run out of Silver City last year for rustling and worse." Samuel felt a prickle of unease. Men like Blackwood brought trouble wherever they went, and Deeming, for all its growing prosperity, was still a small town without a proper sheriff. "They usually stay away from the railroad towns," the blacksmith continued. "Too many people, too much law. Wonder what brings them here." Samuel watched as the men entered the saloon, their spurs jingling on the wooden steps. "Maybe just passing through," he said, though he didn't believe it. The blacksmith shrugged and returned to his work, but Samuel remained uneasy. He finished the job quickly and made his way to the mercantile, where he found Simmons engaged in conversation with Dr. Fletcher. "Heard Blackwood's gang is in town," Simmons was saying. "Nothing good can come of that. As long as they don't cause trouble and move on quickly, we'll be fine," the doctor replied. Though he looked concerned, Samuel approached them. "Anything I can do to help?" Both men turned to him, appraising. "You've handled trouble before," Simmons said. "It wasn't a question." Samuel nodded. His years on the trail had taught him how to recognize danger and how to deal with it when necessary. "I've had my share of encounters." Dr. Fletcher studied him thoughtfully. "We don't have a sheriff, not yet. Town council's been discussing the need, but no one's been appointed. In the meantime, we handle problems collectively." "I'm not looking to get involved in town politics," Samuel clarified, "but I don't like the look of those men, and He hesitated, then finished honestly, "I care about what happens here." The doctor's expression softened. "Because of Penny." Samuel didn't deny it. "Among other reasons. She's special to all of us," Simmons said. "After what happened to her husband, the whole town's protective of her." "What exactly did happen?" Samuel asked. He knew Thomas Harper had been killed by rustlers, but Penny had shared few details. The 2 men exchanged glances. 3 years ago," Dr. Fletcher began, "a group of rustlers hit the Harper ranch. Thomas confronted them and they shot him, left him to bleed out in his own pasture." The doctor's face darkened with the memory. "Penny found him at dawn. He was still alive, barely. She got him into the wagon somehow, brought him all the way to town by herself. I helped her carry him into the doctor's office," Simmons added. "Never seen a woman so covered in blood, but she was calm, focused only on getting him help." "There was nothing I could do," Dr. Fletcher continued. "The bullet had nicked his heart. He held on long enough to say goodbye to her, then he was gone." Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "The rustlers were never caught." "No," the doctor said. "Though there were rumors they were part of Blackwood's gang, nothing ever proven." The significance of Blackwood's arrival in town took on new meaning. If these were the men responsible for Thomas Harper's death, and they recognized Penny. "I need to find Penny," Samuel said, already moving toward the door. "She's at the Wilson place," Simmons called after him. "Their youngest has the croup." Samuel hurried through town, his mind racing. He needed to warn Penny to make sure she stayed away from Blackwood and his men. If they were indeed the ones who had killed her husband, there was no telling what might happen if they encountered her, or what she might do if she recognized them. The Wilson farm was a small property just outside town. Samuel borrowed a horse from the livery stable, promising to return it before nightfall, and rode quickly. He found Penny just leaving the farmhouse, her medical bag in hand. She looked surprised to see him, then concerned as she took in his expression. "Samuel, what's wrong?" "We need to get you back to town," he said, dismounting. "There's trouble." Penny's brow furrowed. "What kind of trouble?" "Jake Blackwood and his gang rode in an hour ago," Samuel said, watching her face carefully. "Simmons and the doctor think they might be the ones who killed Thomas." Penny went very still, her face draining of color. "Blackwood," she repeated. Yes, that was the name. One of the hands from the neighboring ranch mentioned it after Thomas died, said he'd heard Blackwood's gang was operating in the area. She swayed slightly, and Samuel stepped forward to steady her, his hands gentle on her arms. "Penny, I need to get you somewhere safe if they recognize you." Penny straightened, a flash of steel entering her eyes. "I'm not going to hide, Samuel. I've spent 3 years rebuilding my life in Deeming. This is my home, and I won't be driven from it by the men who took Thomas from me." Her determination didn't surprise him, but it did worry him. "I'm not suggesting you leave town," he clarified. "Just that we be cautious until they move on." Penny studied his face. "You're genuinely concerned." "Of course I am," Samuel said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I care about what happens to you, Penny." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes. "Thank you, Samuel, for coming to warn me." She glanced back at the farmhouse. "The Wilson baby is sleeping now, fever broken. I was heading back to town anyway." "I'll ride with you," Samuel said, helping her onto his borrowed horse before mounting behind her. The closeness of her, seated before him on the horse, was both distracting and grounding. Samuel could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair, feel the warmth of her body against his chest. The urge to protect her, to keep her safe from Blackwood and his men, was overwhelming. As they rode back to town, Penny leaned slightly into him. "What do you think they want in Deeming?" "Nothing good," Samuel replied honestly. "Men like that only come to settled areas when they want something, supplies they can't get elsewhere, or information, or—" He trailed off, not wanting to voice the other possibilities. "Or revenge," Penny finished for him. "If they know I'm still here and that I might be able to identify them." Samuel's arms tightened reflexively around her waist. "We don't know that they are aware of you, or that they were definitely the ones who killed Thomas. But you think it's likely." "I think it's a possibility we need to consider," Samuel admitted. They reached town to find it unusually quiet. People were going about their business, but there was a tension in the air, a wariness in how they moved and spoke. Blackwood and his men were still in the saloon, their horses tied up outside. Samuel guided his mount directly to Penny's cabin, avoiding the main street. He helped her dismount, then swung down himself. "Stay here," he said. "Keep the door locked. I'll return the horse to the livery and come straight back." Penny looked like she wanted to argue but nodded instead. "Be careful, Samuel." "Always am," he replied with a reassuring smile that he didn't entirely feel. As Samuel rode back toward town, he considered his options. He had his Winchester rifle in his saddlebags at Penny's cabin and his revolver holstered at his hip. He was confident in his abilities should it come to a fight, but he hoped it wouldn't. The best outcome would be for Blackwood and his men to move on without incident, but something told him it wouldn't be that simple. At the livery stable, Samuel returned the borrowed horse and checked on Copper. Old Joe was unusually subdued, casting nervous glances toward the saloon. "Them fellows been in there since noon," the stable keeper said, drinking heavy and asking questions. Samuel's attention sharpened. "What kind of questions?" "About the town. Who lives here, who's new, who's been around a while." Joe hesitated. "They asked particular about any widows in town." The cold weight in Samuel's stomach turned to ice. "Did they mention any names?" "Not that I heard. But Penny ain't the only widow in Deeming. Could be they're just looking for vulnerable targets." That possibility was hardly more reassuring. "Thanks for the information, Joe. Keep an eye out, will you, if they make a move toward the edge of town." "I'll send word," Joe promised. "You staying at Penny's place still?" Samuel nodded, not bothering to deny what the whole town seemed to know by now. "I'll be there if you need me." As Samuel walked back to Penny's cabin, he kept a watchful eye on the saloon. The shadows were lengthening as afternoon turned to evening, and lamps were being lit in windows throughout town. Soon Penny's light would be shining as well, a beacon that had come to mean safety and welcome to him. But tonight, that light might also serve as a target. When he reached the cabin, he found Penny at the stove, preparing dinner as if it were any other evening. The lamp was already lit in the window, its glow spilling out into the gathering dusk. "Everything all right in town?" she asked as he entered. "Quiet for now," Samuel said, hanging his hat on the peg. "But Joe says Blackwood and his men have been asking questions about widows in town." Penny's hand stilled on the pot she was stirring. "I see." Samuel moved to stand beside her, close enough that his arm brushed hers. "Penny, I think you should consider staying somewhere else tonight. The doctor's perhaps, or with one of the families in town." "And leave you here alone?" she asked, looking up at him with a trace of amusement despite the seriousness of the situation. "Besides, this is my home. I won't be driven from it." Samuel admired her courage even as it frustrated him. "At least let me put out the lamp," he said, nodding toward the window. "No sense in advertising your presence more than necessary." Penny considered this, then shook her head. "The light stays on." "It's a promise I made." "To Thomas," Samuel said softly. "Yes," Penny agreed, "but not just to him anymore." Her eyes met his, conveying a message he wasn't sure he was ready to receive. "It's a promise to anyone who needs to find their way home in the darkness." Samuel understood then that the lamp in the window had become more than a memorial to her husband or even a beacon for travelers. It was a symbol of who Penny was, a guiding light in a dark world, offering compassion and shelter to those in need. And he knew, with sudden clarity, that he had fallen in love with her. The realization should have terrified him, sent him running for the open trail and the solitude he'd cherished for so long. Instead, it filled him with a fierce determination to protect what they'd found together, this fragile beginning of something that could be lasting and true. "All right," he said, touching her cheek gently. "The light stays on, but so do I, and my rifle will be loaded." Penny leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They ate dinner as usual, though the conversation was more subdued. Afterward, as Penny washed the dishes, Samuel cleaned and checked his Winchester. The familiar routine of caring for his weapon settled him, focusing his mind on the potential threat rather than the newly acknowledged feelings churning within him. As night fell completely, the cabin grew quiet. Penny sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of her aprons, while Samuel kept watch by the window, his rifle within easy reach. "Tell me about that valley in Colorado again," Penny said after a long silence. "The one with the wildflowers." Samuel glanced at her, understanding her need for distraction. "It's in a high mountain pass, where the snow doesn't melt until late May. When it does, it's like the whole world bursts into color all at once: Indian paintbrush and columbine, lupines and wild roses." "I'd like to see that someday," Penny said, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. "I'd like to show it to you," Samuel replied, surprising himself with the offer. Penny's hand stilled and she looked up at him. "Would you?" "Yes," Samuel said, realizing he meant it. "When summer comes, if you could leave your patients for a week or two." "Dr. Fletcher has been saying I should take some time away," Penny mused, a small smile playing at her lips. "He worries I work too hard." "Smart man, the doctor." Penny's smile widened. "So they tell me." She set aside her mending and came to stand beside him at the window. "What would it be like, traveling with you, sleeping under the stars?" Samuel could picture it vividly, Penny riding beside him on mountain trails, her face lit with wonder at the vistas he could show her. Sharing a campfire, wrapped in blankets against the high country chill. Watching her discover the beauty he'd seen alone for so many years. "It would be an adventure," he said, "but a comfortable one. I know all the best spots, the safest trails." "I'd trust you to keep me safe," Penny said, her voice soft. Samuel turned to face her fully, struck by the faith in her words. No one had trusted him that way in years, perhaps ever. "Penny." A sound outside interrupted him, the soft nicker of a horse. Not in the barn where Copper and Penny's mare were stabled, but closer to the cabin. Samuel immediately moved away from the window, gesturing for Penny to do the same. He picked up his rifle, checking that it was loaded, and moved to the door. "Stay back," he whispered, "and douse the lamp." This time, Penny didn't argue. She quickly extinguished the lamp in the window, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the glow of the fire. Samuel eased the door open a crack, peering out into the night. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the edge of the garden, a man leading a horse. Another shadow joined the first, and Samuel could make out low voices. "Sure this is the place?" one voice asked. "Has to be," another replied. "Joe at the livery said the Harper woman lives on the edge of town, keeps a lamp in her window. This is the only place that fits." Samuel's jaw tightened. So Blackwood's men had been asking more specific questions than Joe had let on. He closed the door silently and turned to Penny. "It's them," he confirmed in a whisper. "At least two, maybe more." Penny's face was pale in the firelight, but her expression was resolute. "What do we do?" Samuel considered their options. They could try to slip out the back and make for town, but if there were more men watching the cabin, they'd be spotted. They could stay put and hope the men merely scouted the area and left, or they could prepare to defend themselves if the men decided to approach. "Is there anywhere in town they won't look for you?" Samuel asked. "Somewhere unexpected," Penny thought for a moment. "The church, perhaps. Father Matthews keeps a small room there for travelers in need." "Good," Samuel said. "When I give the word, I want you to go out the back door and head for the church. Stay in the shadows, move quickly but quietly." "And what will you do?" Penny asked, already gathering her shawl. "Create a distraction," Samuel said grimly. "Give you time to get away." Penny shook her head. "I won't leave you here to face them alone." "Penny." "No, Samuel." Her voice was quiet but firm. "We stay together, or we both go." Samuel wanted to argue, to insist on her safety above all else. But he recognized the determination in her eyes, the same strength that had kept her going after her husband's murder, that had built a new life from the ashes of the old. "All right," he conceded. "Together. But if I tell you to run, you run. Promise me that." Penny hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." Samuel moved back to the door, rifle at the ready. The voices outside had gone quiet, which concerned him more than their earlier conversation. He strained to hear any sound of movement, but the night was still. Then suddenly, a pounding on the door made Penny jump and Samuel raise his rifle. "Harper woman," a rough voice called. "We know you're in there. Open up." Samuel gestured for Penny to stay back. "What do you want?" he called through the door. There was a moment of silence then. "Who's that?" "The widow living alone now," "She's not alone," Samuel replied, his voice hard. "And she's not interested in visitors." A different voice spoke then, deeper than the first. "We just want to talk. Got some information about her husband's killers she might want to hear." Samuel glanced at Penny, who had gone very still. "That's Jake Blackwood himself," he whispered. "I recognize his voice from when he came to ask Thomas about buying our ranch." The confirmation of Blackwood's identity and his connection to Thomas made Samuel's decision easier. "You can leave your information with me," he called. "I'll see she gets it." A harsh laugh came from the other side of the door. "Don't think so, mister. Our business is with the widow. Now step aside or things might get unpleasant." Samuel felt rather than saw Penny move to his side, a hand touching his arm. "Let me speak to them," she whispered. "Absolutely not," Samuel hissed. "If they wanted to harm me, they could have done so already," Penny reasoned. "They've been in town all day. Let me hear what they have to say." Before Samuel could stop her, Penny called out, "I'm listening, Mr. Blackwood. What information do you have about my husband's death?" There was a pause, then the deep voice again, sounding pleased. "So you do remember me, Mrs. Harper. Good. Why don't you open up and we can have a civilized conversation?" Penny looked at Samuel, a question in her eyes. He shook his head firmly, then positioned himself to the side of the door, rifle ready. "You can speak through the door," Penny called, "or leave and come back in the daylight." Another pause, longer this time. Then Blackwood spoke again, his tone harder. "Have it your way. But you should know the men who killed your husband weren't part of my outfit. It was the Mendoza brothers from down Mexico way. They're the ones you want." Samuel and Penny exchanged glances, both skeptical of this claim. "And why would you ride all the way to Deeming to tell me this?" Penny asked. "Professional courtesy," Blackwood replied, an obvious lie. "Don't like being blamed for another man's work. Thought you might want to know the truth." "I appreciate the information," Penny said, her voice remarkably steady. "Now, if that's all, it's late and I'd like to retire." A low chuckle came from outside. "Not quite all, Mrs. Harper. See, we heard you might have something that belongs to us." A certain map your husband had, showing the location of a silver deposit up in the mountains. Samuel raised an eyebrow at Penny, who looked genuinely confused. "I don't know anything about a map," she called. "Now that's disappointing," Blackwood said, his voice hardening further. "Because your husband told us he'd hidden it somewhere safe before we—" He stopped abruptly, seemingly realizing his mistake. In that moment of silence, the truth became clear. Blackwood had just confessed to being involved in Thomas Harper's murder, and he'd revealed the motive: a map to silver. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. "You just admitted to killing Thomas Harper," he called. "That was careless of you, Blackwood." "And who's going to care?" Blackwood shot back, his tone now openly threatening. "There's no sheriff in this town, no law to speak of. Just a bunch of shopkeepers and farmers too scared to stand up to real men." "There's me," Samuel said simply. Another laugh, this one joined by several others. "So there were at least 3 or 4 men out there," Samuel noted grimly. "1 man against 4, Blackwood said, confirming Samuel's count. "Not good odds, friend." "I've faced worse," Samuel replied. A moment of silence followed, then the sound of a match being struck. The smell of tobacco drifted through the door as someone lit a cigar. "Here's how this is going to go," Blackwood said, his voice calmer now but no less menacing. "The widow's going to give us that map, or we're going to burn this pretty little cabin to the ground. With or without you two inside is your choice." Samuel looked at Penny, whose face had gone chalk white. "There is no map," she whispered. "Thomas never mentioned anything about silver." "I believe you," Samuel assured her, "but they don't, and they're not leaving without something." Penny glanced around the cabin, her gaze falling on a small wooden box on the mantel. "Thomas's papers," she said. Everything he left behind is in there. Letters, the deed to the ranch, our marriage certificate. Get it, Samuel instructed, and anything else of value you can't bear to lose. We're going to have to make a run for it. While Penny hurriedly gathered her most precious possessions, Samuel considered their options. The back door led to the barn, but Blackwood's men had likely surrounded the cabin. Their best chance might be to create a diversion, then slip out in the confusion. "Is there a cellar?" he asked suddenly. Penny nodded, pointing to a trapdoor partially hidden by a rug near the stove. "It's small, just for storing preserves. Does it have an outside entrance?" "Yes, behind the cabin, covered by a slanted door." Samuel felt a surge of hope. "Perfect. Here's what we'll do. I'll fire a shot through the front door, then another through the window. When they return fire, we'll drop into the cellar and out the back way." Penny clutched the wooden box to her chest, her expression uncertain. "And then what?" "Then we run for town," Samuel said. "There's strength in numbers, and even Blackwood won't want to take on the whole settlement." Before Penny could respond, a new sound came from outside, the unmistakable splash of liquid being poured, followed by the acrid smell of kerosene. "Time's up, widow," Blackwood called. "Map or fire?" Samuel knew they were out of time for elaborate plans. "Get to the trapdoor," he ordered Penny. "Now." As she moved, Samuel took aim at the front door and fired. The shot splintered the wood and was followed by a cry of pain. Good, he'd hit someone. Immediately, gunfire erupted from outside, bullets tearing through the walls and windows. Samuel ducked low and made his way to where Penny was pulling up the trapdoor, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. "Go," he urged, providing covering fire with another shot aimed at the window. Penny descended quickly, Samuel right behind her. He pulled the trapdoor shut just as the front door of the cabin burst open, Blackwood's men storming in. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and preserves. Samuel could hear Penny breathing rapidly beside him. "This way," she whispered, taking his hand and guiding him through the darkness. They reached the outside entrance, a slanted door that would open upward. Samuel cautiously pushed against it, feeling resistance. "Something's blocking it," he whispered. Above them, they could hear the sounds of Blackwood's men searching the cabin, furniture being overturned, glass breaking. "They must have put something heavy on the cellar door," Penny said, fear evident in her voice despite her attempt to stay calm. Samuel pressed harder against the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. "The map ain't here, boss," they heard one of the men call from above. "Tear the place apart," Blackwood's voice ordered. "It has to be somewhere, and find out where those two went." The sound of more destruction followed, including the crash of what must have been Penny's precious few dishes. She flinched beside Samuel but remained silent. Samuel's mind raced, searching for a way out. The cellar was small, with no other exits. They could try to wait out Blackwood's men, hoping they'd leave once they were convinced the map wasn't there. But if they decided to burn the cabin anyway? A new sound reached them from above, the splash of more kerosene being poured. "If there's no map," Blackwood's voice said, "then there's no reason to leave this place standing. Burn it down, boys. Maybe that'll smoke out our missing friends." Penny's hand tightened on Samuel's arm. "They're going to burn the cabin," she whispered, horror in her voice. "We need to make noise," Samuel decided. "Let them know we're down here. They want that map badly enough that they won't risk destroying it." "But there is no map," Penny reminded him. "They don't know that for certain," Samuel said. "It's our only chance." Without waiting for her agreement, Samuel pounded on the cellar door with the butt of his rifle. "Blackwood," he shouted. "We're in the cellar. The map is down here with us." There was a moment of silence from above, then the sound of boots approaching. "Well, well," Blackwood's voice came closer now. "Thought you two had slipped away somehow. Should have checked the cellar first thing." "We have the map," Samuel called. "But if you burn this place down, it burns too." Another pause. "Slide it out under the door." "Can't," Samuel replied. "You've blocked the cellar door, and we're not coming up the inside ladder just to get shot." A low chuckle. "Smart man. All right, we'll clear the door, but you two come out slow with that map in plain sight or we start shooting." Samuel heard the scrape of something heavy being moved from the cellar door. He cocked his Winchester, ready for whatever came next. "Stay behind me," he whispered to Penny. "And be ready to run if you get the chance." "I'm not leaving you," she whispered back fiercely. The cellar door lifted suddenly, moonlight flooding in along with the barrel of a gun. Samuel acted instinctively, using his rifle to knock the gun aside, then surging upward through the opening, tackling the man holding the weapon. They went down hard, Samuel on top. He brought the butt of his rifle down on the man's head, rendering him unconscious. But there was no time to celebrate this small victory. Another of Blackwood's men appeared, gun drawn. Samuel rolled, narrowly avoiding the shot that kicked up dirt where he'd been a moment before. He fired his Winchester from the ground, catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him backward. "Penny, run!" Samuel shouted, scrambling to his feet. But before Penny could emerge from the cellar, Blackwood himself appeared, holding a burning torch in one hand and a revolver in the other. "That's far enough," he said, training his gun on Samuel. "Drop the rifle." Samuel hesitated, calculating his chances of getting a shot off before Blackwood could fire. They weren't good. "I said drop it," Blackwood repeated, moving his aim pointedly toward the cellar opening where Penny would appear. "Or the widow gets it first." Reluctantly, Samuel let his Winchester fall to the ground. "Now kick it away." Samuel complied, watching his best means of defense skitter out of reach. Blackwood smiled, the torchlight making his scarred face look demonic. "Now about that map." "There is no map," Penny's voice came as she emerged from the cellar, the wooden box still clutched to her chest. "Thomas never mentioned any silver to me." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "He told us he'd hidden it somewhere safe, said we'd never find it." "He was bluffing," Samuel said, drawing Blackwood's attention back to him. "Trying to buy time, or lying to protect his wife," Blackwood countered. "What's in the box, widow?" Penny held the box tighter. "Just papers." "Personal things. Nothing of value to you." Blackwood gestured with his gun. "Open it, slowly." With trembling hands, Penny lifted the lid of the box. Inside were exactly what she described: letters, documents, a few small keepsakes. "See for yourself," she said, her voice steadier now. "There's nothing about silver or any map." Blackwood stepped closer, keeping his gun trained on Samuel while he peered into the box. "Spread them out on the ground," he ordered. Penny knelt and carefully laid out the contents of the box. Marriage certificate, deed to the ranch, letters tied with ribbon, a pocket watch, a small Bible. Blackwood nudged the items with his boot, disappointment evident on his face. "If it's not here, where is it?" he demanded. "It doesn't exist," Samuel insisted. "Your men killed an innocent man for nothing." Blackwood's face darkened. "Harper wasn't innocent. He refused to sell his land when I made a fair offer, said he'd die before letting me have it." A cruel smile twisted his lips. "And he did." Penny made a small, pained sound, and Samuel wished desperately that he had his rifle in hand. The urge to put a bullet in Blackwood's head was nearly overwhelming. "You got what you wanted," Samuel said, struggling to keep his voice level. "The ranch was sold. There's nothing left for you here." "Except the map," Blackwood insisted stubbornly. "And I'm not leaving without it." "Then you'll be here a long time," Penny said, rising to her feet with newfound strength in her voice. "Because it doesn't exist." Blackwood studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Maybe you're right. Maybe Harper was bluffing, but I can't take that chance." He turned to one of his men who had emerged from the cabin. Search every inch of this place. Tear up the floorboards if you have to." "And what about them?" the man asked, nodding toward Samuel and Penny. Blackwood considered, the torch in his hand throwing flickering shadows across his face. "Tie them up for now. We'll decide what to do with them once we've searched the place." Samuel tensed, preparing to make a move despite the gun aimed at him. He couldn't let them tie him up, couldn't leave Penny at their mercy. But before he could act, a new voice called from the darkness. "That's far enough, Blackwood." Samuel turned to see Dr. Fletcher stepping into the circle of torchlight, a shotgun in his hands. He wasn't alone. Behind him were Simmons from the mercantile, Joe from the livery, and at least a dozen other townsmen, all armed. "This doesn't concern you," Blackwood said, but Samuel could hear the uncertainty in his voice now. "When you threaten one of ours, it concerns all of us," the doctor replied. "Deeming might not have a sheriff, but we take care of our own." Blackwood glanced around, clearly reassessing the situation. His gang was outnumbered 3-1, and 2 of his men were already wounded. "We're just looking for what's rightfully ours," he tried. "A map Harper stole from me." "There is no map," Dr. Fletcher said. "And nothing here belongs to you. Now drop your weapons, all of you, or we start shooting." For a tense moment, Samuel thought Blackwood might try to fight his way out, but then the outlaw slowly lowered his gun. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes fixed on Penny. "Yes, it is," Samuel said, stepping forward to place himself between Penny and Blackwood. "You killed her husband, and now you've tried to burn her out of her home. If you ever come near her again, I'll kill you myself." The conviction in his voice must have reached Blackwood, because a flicker of something like fear passed across the outlaw's face. He dropped his torch to the ground, where it hissed and went out in the damp earth. "Tie them up, Doctor," Fletcher ordered, and several of the townsmen moved forward with rope. As Blackwood and his men were being bound, the doctor approached Samuel and Penny. "Are you both all right?" Penny nodded, though Samuel could see she was shaking. "Yes, thanks to Samuel, and to you all for coming." "Joe saw Blackwood's men heading this way and raised the alarm," the doctor explained. "Took a little time to gather everyone, or we'd have been here sooner." "You came just in time," Samuel assured him, retrieving his Winchester from where it had fallen. The doctor looked at the cabin, where the smell of kerosene was still strong. "They were going to burn you out." "Yes," Penny said, her voice catching. "Everything I have is in there." "The kerosene didn't catch," Samuel told her gently. "The cabin is still standing. It will smell for a while, but it's safe." Relief washed over Penny's face, followed quickly by exhaustion. She swayed slightly on her feet, and Samuel stepped closer, putting an arm around her shoulders to steady her. "What will happen to them?" she asked, nodding toward Blackwood and his men, who were now securely tied. "We'll take them to Silver City tomorrow," Dr. Fletcher said. "The sheriff there has been looking for them for months. They'll hang for what they've done, I expect." Penny nodded, but Samuel could tell the thought brought her little comfort. Vengeance wouldn't bring back her husband or erase the terror of this night. "You should rest," he told her softly. "It's been a long night." The townsmen were already leading Blackwood and his gang away, heading for the jail and deeming that had stood empty until now. Dr. Fletcher lingered, concern evident on his face. "Penny, why don't you come stay at our house tonight? Martha would be glad of the company, and you shouldn't be alone after what's happened." "Thank you, Doctor, but I'm not alone," Penny said, looking up at Samuel with a trust that humbled him. "And I won't be driven from my home, not by them, not by fear." The doctor nodded, understanding in his eyes as he glanced between them. "Very well, but if you need anything, anything at all, send word." After he'd gone, Samuel and Penny surveyed the damage to the cabin. Inside, furniture had been overturned, dishes broken, and the smell of kerosene permeated everything. but the structure itself was intact, and most of the mess could be cleaned up. "It could have been worse," Samuel said, righting a chair that had been knocked over. Penny nodded, gathering the scattered contents of Thomas's box and carefully replacing them. "Much worse. We're alive and they're caught. That's what matters." Samuel watched her, marveling at her resilience. "You're an extraordinary woman, Penelope Harper." She looked up, a small smile touching her lips despite the exhaustion evident on her face. "And you, Samuel Wilder, are a man I'm very glad happened to notice my light." They worked together to set the cabin to rights, clearing away the worst of the mess and opening the windows to let out the kerosene smell. It was nearly dawn by the time they finished, the eastern sky beginning to lighten. "We should try to get some rest," Samuel said, noticing how Penny's movements had slowed, her eyes heavy with fatigue. "Yes," she agreed, moving toward her curtained sleeping area. But at the partition, she paused and turned back to him. "Samuel, would you stay with me, just to hold me? I don't think I can be alone right now." The request, made with such simple honesty, touched Samuel deeply. "Of course," he said. Behind the curtain, Penny's bed was narrow but neat, with a patchwork quilt and plump pillows. She lay down fully clothed, and Samuel stretched out beside her, drawing her into his arms. She fit perfectly against him, her head tucked under his chin, her breathing gradually slowing as she relaxed into his embrace. "Thank you," she murmured, already half asleep, "for everything." Samuel pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep now," he whispered. "I'll be here when you wake." And as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtain, Samuel realized that for the first time in 17 years, he had no desire to be anywhere else but here, holding this remarkable woman, in the cabin with the light that had guided him home. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Blackwood and his gang were transported to Silver City, where they were indeed wanted for numerous crimes. Word came back that they would stand trial for the murder of Thomas Harper, among other charges, and there was little doubt they would hang. The news brought a sense of closure to Penny, though she admitted to Samuel that it didn't ease the loss as much as she'd expected. "Nothing can bring Thomas back," she said as they sat by the fire one evening, a week after the confrontation. "But knowing the men who took him from me will face justice. It helps, a little," Samuel nodded, understanding. "Justice isn't the same as healing. That takes time." Penny studied him thoughtfully. "You've lost people too." "Everyone does eventually," Samuel said. "But yes, I've had my share of grief." "Is that why you've wandered for so long? Because staying in one place meant facing that grief?" Her insight startled him. "I never thought of it that way," Samuel admitted. "But you might be right." Moving always seemed easier than staying put, dealing with the memories. Penny's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "And now? What seems easier now?" Samuel looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, lit warmly by the firelight. "Now, the thought of leaving seems harder than the thought of staying." A smile spread across Penny's face, reaching her eyes and making them shine. "I was hoping you might say that." "I still don't know if I can sleep indoors every night," Samuel cautioned, not wanting to promise more than he could deliver. "Some habits are hard to break." "We'll take it one night at a time," Penny said. "And if you need to sleep under the stars occasionally, I might just join you." The image of Penny beside him under the vast western sky, starlight in her hair, filled Samuel with a contentment he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "I'd like that." The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that felt, to Samuel's surprise, like the beginnings of a real life. He found steady work in Deeming, first helping Simmons at the Mercantile, then taking on the role of livery manager when old Joe decided his bones were too creaky for the job. The position suited Samuel, allowing him to work with horses while also providing a stable income. Penny continued her work with Dr. Fletcher, her skill and compassion making her invaluable to the town. She became a familiar sight, riding out to remote homesteads to check on patients when the doctor couldn't make the trip, always returning to the cabin where Samuel waited. And each night, the lamp burned in the window, a symbol of their growing bond and a beacon for anyone who might need shelter from the darkness. As winter gave way to spring, Samuel realized he hadn't slept outdoors in months. The walls of Penny's cabin, their cabin now, in all but name, no longer felt confining. Instead, they represented safety, warmth, the promise of Penny's presence. One evening in late April, as wildflowers began to carpet the hills around Deeming, Samuel returned from the livery to find Penny sitting on the porch, a letter in her hands and an odd expression on her face. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her. "Bad news." "No," she said slowly. "Surprising news. It's from Thomas's brother in Missouri. I'd written to tell him about Blackwood's capture and the trial." She handed Samuel the letter. "Read it yourself." Samuel scanned the letter, his eyebrows rising as he reached the key paragraph. "He says Thomas spoke to him about a silver deposit he discovered just before he died. But there was no map. Thomas had the location memorized and only shared it verbally with his brother." Penny nodded. All this time, Blackwood was right about the silver, but wrong about the map. And now Thomas's brother wants to know if we're interested in partnering with him to develop the claim. Samuel handed the letter back, studying Penny's face. "Are you interested? I mean," Penny considered the question. "I don't need silver to be happy. But the money could do a lot of good, expand the doctor's practice, maybe build a proper hospital for Deeming." She looked at Samuel. "What do you think?" "I think," Samuel said carefully, "that you're still thinking of others first, even when fortune literally falls into your lap." He took her hand. "It's one of the many things I love about you." Penny's eyes widened at the word, which Samuel had never spoken aloud before, though they both had felt it growing between them for months. "You love me," Samuel nodded, suddenly certain. "I do, have for a while now." A radiant smile spread across Penny's face. "I love you too, Samuel, more than I ever thought I could love again." Samuel pulled her close, kissing her with a tenderness that belied the strength of his feelings. When they parted, both a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Penny," he said softly. "Not because of silver or property or anything else, just because I want to spend my life with you, keeping that light burning in the window for whoever might need it." Tears sprang to Penny's eyes, but her smile never faltered. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Wilder." They were married in June, with the entire town of Deeming in attendance. Dr. Fletcher gave Penny away, and even crusty old Joe shed a tear or two during the ceremony. Penny wore a simple dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair, and Samuel thought she had never looked more beautiful. After the celebration, they returned to their cabin, officially theirs now, as Samuel had insisted on buying it outright from Penny so they could start their married life as true partners. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now shared, Penny traced the lines of Samuel's face with gentle fingers. "Happy?" she asked. Samuel caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "More than I knew was possible, even though you're sleeping indoors," Penny teased. Samuel smiled, pulling her closer. "Turns out a roof isn't so bad when the right person is under it with you." "And the open trail?" Penny asked, more serious now. "Do you miss it?" Samuel considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "The freedom of it, the solitude. But not enough to trade what I've found here." He kissed her softly. "Besides, you promised to come see that valley of wildflowers with me. We'll have our adventures together." Penny nestled against him, contentment in every line of her body. I'll hold you to that." As they drifted toward sleep, Samuel's gaze fell on the lamp still burning in the window. Once, he had seen it as just a light, a curious beacon on the edge of a town he'd been passing through. Now he understood it was more a promise, a welcome, a symbol of the love that had found him when he least expected it. A cowboy who had never slept indoors, who had drifted from place to place like a tumbleweed on the wind, had finally found his home. Not in a building or a town, but in the heart of a woman who had left a light burning for him, guiding him out of his solitude and into a life he'd never dared to dream possible. "Sleep well, my love," Penny murmured, already half dreaming. "I will," Samuel replied, knowing it was true. Under this roof, in this bed with this woman beside him, he had found a peace that had eluded him for 17 years. The light burned on in the window, no longer just for travelers or lost souls, but as a testament to the love that had brought them together. And in its warm glow, Samuel and Penny Wilder began their life together. Two solitary lights that had found each other in the vast darkness of the western night. The years that followed brought changes to Deeming and to Samuel and Penny's life together. The silver claim proved valuable, though not the bonanza Blackwood had imagined. With the proceeds, Penny helped Dr. Fletcher establish a small hospital for the growing town, while Samuel invested in expanding the livery stable into a proper ranch on the outskirts of town. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a son they named William Thomas Wilder, with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Sarah Elizabeth, with a crown of copper curls that matched her mother's. Through it all, the lamp continued to burn in the window of their home, a tradition Penny refused to abandon even as they moved from the small cabin to a more substantial house to accommodate their growing family. "You never know who might need to find their way home," she would say whenever Samuel teased her about the cost of lamp oil. And occasionally, travelers would indeed appear at their door, drawn by the light when storms raged or night fell too quickly for them to reach town. None was ever turned away. The Wilder home became known throughout the territory as a haven for those in need, a place where the light always burned and the welcome was always warm. Samuel still took to the trail sometimes, especially in the spring when the wildflowers bloomed in the high country. But now Penny rode beside him, and later their children too, all of them sleeping under the stars together. These journeys were no longer an escape from confinement, but a celebration of freedom shared with those he loved. On a warm evening in the summer of 1888, exactly 10 years after Samuel had first noticed the light in Penny's window, the family gathered on the porch of their home. William, now 8, was whittling a stick with the pocket knife Samuel had given him for his birthday, while 6-year-old Sarah played with the rag doll Penny had made her. "Tell us the story again, Pa," William requested, looking up from his handiwork. "About how you and Ma met." Samuel exchanged a smile with Penny, who sat beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his. "Well, it all started with a storm and a light burning in a window." As he recounted the tale his children had heard many times before, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From a solitary drifter who couldn't bear the confinement of walls to a husband, father, and respected member of a community. All because a woman had kept a promise, leaving a light burning in the darkness. Later, after the children were asleep, Samuel and Penny stood together at the window where the lamp still glowed, casting its warm light out into the night. 10 years, Penny murmured, leaning against his shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you appeared at my door." "Best night of my life," Samuel said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Even if I didn't know it at the time." Penny turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. Though a decade had passed, her eyes were as bright and clear as the night he'd first met her on the streets of Deeming. "Any regrets?" she asked. "About staying, building a life here." Samuel shook his head, certain of his answer. "Not one. I was lost for a long time, Penny. Didn't even know it until I found you." "We found each other," she corrected gently, reaching up to trace the lines that time and laughter had etched around his eyes. "And I thank God for that every day." As they stood together in the circle of lamplight, Samuel thought of all the miles he had traveled, all the nights he had slept under the stars, all the years he had spent avoiding the very thing he had found with Penny. A home, a family, a place to belong. The cowboy who had never slept indoors had found, in the end, that the greatest freedom wasn't in wandering but in coming home to the woman who had left a light burning for him, and to the love that had guided him out of the darkness and into the warmth of her heart.